I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to episode 122 of Postcards from a Dying World. Returning to Postcards is author John Shirley, the author of Stormland, Demons, City Come A-Walkin, Wetbones, and recently Suborbital7. He also has a recent Western. What's the title of the new Western? It's Gunmetal something.
Gunmetal Mountain.
Gunmetal Mountain, right. The second Cleve book, and the first Western of which I have a review on my blog is fantastic, so I'm looking forward to reading that too. So we will talk about that Gunmetal Mountain here at some point too. I haven't read it yet. It's on my list. It will be soon. However, John, listeners will be also reminded, if they're regular listeners of this podcast, that I often mention Wetbones as being my favorite horror novel of all time. So I just want to point out that you are the author of that. I consider you, sir, to have masterpieces in both science fiction and horror, with City Come A-Walkin as I think one of the most amazing entries of cyberpunk ever. So welcome to the show. I'm excited to have you here and to talk about Suborbital7. But first, this weekend you were at Lovecraft Fest. What did you read at Lovecraft Fest this weekend?
I read a new poem, a new one of my rhyming weird poetry formatted poems. Right. Like in my book, The Voice of the Burning House, which is nominated for an Elgin Award for poetry. We'll see if it gets it.
Well, that would be awesome. I love that book too. I blurbed that book, as a matter of fact. And didn't you read something from really weird stories too?
Yes, Your Spies Have Been Alert.
Yes.
I also read from the story A Boy and His Shoggoth. The title is a little bit of an homage to Harlan Ellison's A Boy and His Dog, but it's about an autistic teenager who runs into a shoggoth, and it's a relatively young shoggoth, only a couple hundred years old, and they become fast friends, kind of telepathically through these tendrils that sink into the kid's brain from the shoggoth, and he rides it around, and there's a whole plot having to do with Russian spies and so on too, but it's about this, his adventures in Antarctica with his shoggoth named Tikali.
Right.
His shoggoth is named Tikali.
Right. And listeners might want to be aware that they might think, oh wait, I have really weird stories in my collection. Mm-hmm. But you also have a new edition of it.
A new edition with 4 new stories, and the book's been re-edited. It's even stronger now, and a new introduction, and that's out from Jackanapes Press. And the premise of that book is that the book is in 4 parts, and each part is guaranteed, after the first, to be weirder than the last. So it's really weird stories, and then really weird stories, and really weird stories, and really weird stories, finally, in those 4 sections.
Right.
so the reader can decide if that's true, if it lives up to my claims. I believe it does.
Yeah.
The last part is in some ways very challenging, emotionally, and also I would think to some extent intellectually. But the book is in all of these different genres, crime stories that are really weird, and science fiction stories that are really weird, and horror stories that are really weird, and uncategorizable stories, except that they're really weird.
Well, and it's one of your classic collections, and one of the things that's great about your work too is that you are very prolific with the short stories, and if somebody wants to get into reading collections of your work, there's quite a few of them to choose from, and really, 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 really weird stories is one that has a really great theme in the way it's put together.
Nice illustrations too.
Yeah.
Lots of illustrations, and my newest story collection is The Feverish Stars. That's out. So that's stories that haven't been collected into a book before, and relatively recent ones.
Yeah,
So,
and I have a review up of Feverish Stars on my blog as well, and I highly recommend Feverish Stars. And of course, you can't go wrong with Black Butterflies, which is I think one of your best collections. And of course, I'm a big fan of Living Shadows. I think is a great mix of.
Yeah, it got my only review in the New York Times thus far has been for Living Shadows, and they just really praised it.
Yeah.
So, and that just made my heart glow.
Yeah. It's I think that's I think that's a fantastic. As somebody who's studied your work pretty deeply, I think it's a really, really good mix of stuff from different kind of times and eras in your fiction, and of course, it has Buried in the Sky, which is one of my favorite of your novellas, which has a very kind of Lovecraftian sky mall thing going on in it.
Lovecraftian sky mall is exactly what it is.
Yeah. And Beneath the Sky is absolutely one of my favorites of yours. So I definitely want to recommend that. So I just wanted to get a few things out of the way before we talk about Suborbital, the story of how it came to be. And then we're going to talk we'll first talk about it without spoilers. And then we'll get into a little bit of the process, as we always do on this podcast. The next episode after this one, we'll be doing I had somebody come on and guest the show and talk to me about Last Night to Kill Nazis, and to complete the books that were on the Southern California book tour, I will be having Cody on soon to be doing Vertical. So all three books will be getting the treatment here on the podcast. But today we're going to talk about Suborbital 7. What is now? This was published by Alon Entertainment.
Well, it's published by Titan. Books, which is Titan Books is just another imprint of Penguin Random House eventually, which just owns so much. And but it was in relation to Alon Entertainment, and they have the rights to, they have produced things like The Expanse, for example. That it's the same company, and they have produced a lot of spin-off material from Blade Runner, graphic novels, and they have all the print rights for Blade Runner, and they're involved in the movies too, and so they're kind of a multimedia company, and this book is being developed as a screenplay now. Whether that it will go in the next stage, I don't know. But Writers Guild strike is over, so they can work freely on the screenplay. So I'm not working on the screenplay. I don't know who he is. I just know there is a screenplay of Suborbital 7.
Mhm. And this book really reads like a movie, and it it's very propulsive and kind of moves with like kind of a space action movie quality, and it seems like it was absolutely your intention and
Well, sure, but you know, I've always written in scenes.
yeah.
Um, um, I mean, there are books where I go into people's subjective point of view a lot, like in Demons and some other works, but I generally write in scenes, and I have always been a kind of a cinematic writer. I've always seen a movie in my head that I'm kind of looking for the best way to describe as still have good prose, and um, so I feel that it you know a lot of my stuff it is very cinematic and could be adapted, of course. Um, Years ago, there was interest in my novel Crawlers. I've been trying to think of whether, looking at the possibility of getting a new edition of Crawlers, and it's a kind of a cyberpunk horror novel, is what it is. I mean, don't want to give away too much, but and it's been around for a long time. It got great reviews. It went through 2 printings, and then it was picked up into obscurity.
Right. Well, and that's one of the reasons why you hear managers will tell you a lot of times, like, go ahead and write the book because we want you to control the IP, and a lot of that. And it seems like that might be some of the process that Alcon's doing by developing these projects first as novels.
There's something there. Yes, it is a process like that. I and they are doing this together.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's aimed at being developed for more media than it is now. But the book is I think a strong, readable techno thriller set in space. It's in a lot of libraries, and library journals said it was like Tom Clancy in space, and they said it worked really well, and they praised it a lot. So
I totally agree.
it's a strong book, and I'm just glad it got to this point, whether or not it's ever made into something. Years ago, I pitched the idea of a suborbital military troop that would move into space over targets and then drop down on the targets from above. That, like, as if Delta Force, for example, were moved from some base in the United States over to a base in, let's say, Syria by orbit, and they go up in the United States, and then they move via orbit to directly over the point they want to engage, and they drop from there straight down, and through technology I describe in the book. So I had this idea, and I even had pictures made up, and there was interest in a producer, and once more nothing came of it, but I've just kept it there percolating, and for me it evolved from that kind of idea. There's a little bit of something analogous to it in the Halo games, which I forget what it's called, but it's kind of a far future version of a similar idea, where these little pods drop directly down from orbit and release soldiers. And it's a similar idea, but I had mine first, and then they thought of it too, I guess.
Well, one of the things is somebody who's a fan of your work, and for example, I'm an absolute huge fan of Stormland, which was your novel, your sci-fi novel from last year, the year before. Anyways, with Stormland, I think you're being much more in the vein of something I'm used to from you, with being very experimental about the characters and coming up with very interesting backstories for the characters. And what's kind of cool about Suborbital 7 is it almost makes me feel it feels like I have a different experience when I'm reading your tie-in work, even though, like, for example, I think your tie-in work, for example, your Constantine book is elevates the tie-in genre quite a bit, right? But what I liked about Suborbital 7 is it almost felt like an existing property. Like, even though these are all new characters, they're all new, it felt very comfortable and it felt very like kind of in the lane of something that already existed. I don't
Oh
know.
yeah, it's like being there for the birth
Yeah,
of a media franchise, or like being there at the birth of James Bond, if you
right.
like you were looking. I like, this is in my imagination and my in my pompous imagination. I imagine you looking over the shoulder of Ian Fleming as he writes Dr. No on his typewriter.
Right.
So they were novels first, the James Bond books.
Oh, last year at Lilly Library, I held the straight out of the typewriter manuscript for Goldfinger.
Really?
Yeah, they have all the Ian Fleming papers at IU, and when we and Goldfinger, there was another title there scratched out, and Goldfinger was handwritten on there. And one of the things that was crazy was the first sentence of Goldfinger, the first line of dialogue, was not typed on there; it was handwritten by Fleming, like later, like and so these are the kinds of, as an archive nerd,
Yeah.
right? These are one of the reasons why I think like that these old archives are just amazing to look at. Like,
Well, yeah, and all you see the writer's mental process,
yeah,
come alive there. And of course, that would have been an early draft of the manuscript, probably the second one,
yeah.
or perhaps just after the first, maybe the first one before he typed up the second.
I think it
Uh,
was the first before he typed up the second was
mm,
what they said. And you know what people like, um, and this is kind of an aside, but that one of the things that's great about these archives, for example, Fullerton has Frank Herbert's Dune straight out of the typewriter, which I've seen. And the amount of red pen that's on there,
oh
like
yeah.
it's like really amazing to see like into the minds of these writers. So
Mm.
like just shout out there, people, like if you want to go visit these places, they exist. And
Yeah, and
what
you don't see it anymore,
right,
mostly because we all work on computers, almost all of us. There are
right.
still some very highly regarded writers who write things by hand and then type it up later. So that's around. They're
Yeah.
mostly in the more literary area. Lincoln in the Bardo, the author of that,
Clive Barker still hand writes.
does he?
Yeah.
See, there are people who do it, and I never hand wrote much. I always typed it up, but I started writing on a manual typewriter. Neuromancer was written on a manual typewriter.
Yeah.
Ironic.
Well, there are archives are starting to do digital archives, which is like hard because now they're gonna have to researchers are gonna have to go through thumb drives to look at multiple drafts
I know
online.
it's really difficult because you're just going for the smoothest thing possible. And although sometimes people will work on a computer and print a thing out and then hand correct it because it looks different when you print it out and look at it on paper than it does on the screen. And for some reason, you notice more things. So you might actually, when editing, want to do that if you're writing something, print a thing out and read it in that form rather than just on the screen. And you'll see more things that need work. And then you make pen marks, and you can keep that later for an archive.
Mhm.
Uh, and, but a lot of that is completely lost, just as email is pretty much destroying, if not completely destroyed, the literary uh,
Correspondence. Yeah.
subcategory of epistolary literature.
Yeah.
where letters, the literature of letters, and and there are many books out, of course, the letters of Mark Twain or the letters of Ernest Hemingway or whatever, uh, and those kinds of books are going to become extinct in the future, because who saves email letters, and who makes an effort in an email to write literally? Everybody's in
Right.
a hurry.
Yeah. Yeah. You and I have lots of one sentence emails to each
Yes,
other. They're not going to be fun to study.
I people, and if I even write a long email, people will kind of like gloss it. They'll skim it.
Yeah.
They may not respond to a lot of it because they're just used to doing everything rapidly on email. So you can waste your time. People, so I print out whatever I hope will be preserved.
Well, I think the only other, or one of the other really famous handwriters is Quentin Tarantino handwrites all of his screenplays.
Oh yeah.
Before he I know he does later type drafts, but he writes the first draft always by hand.
Well,
And
that works for him, and that's great. Actually, it helps you. It's the slowness of it gives you really a lot more chance to think.
I still outline by hand. I outline by hand all the time. So like as I have this notebook here full of outlining. Like so I still do that. But back to Suborbital 7. So now before we get into spoilers and get into process and those things, one of the things that I wanted to say about the story is that the story has a real problem. There's that kind of that subgenre of problem solving in space, right? Where there's a crisis in space, and so you have the soldiers that use the suborbital plane, which is kind of a neat thing. And did you say that you kind of you have like a design in your head or drawings of what the plane looked like? Because it came off
Sure.
like I could see it very strongly in my mind when I was
I describe it.
Yeah.
It's this kind of delta thing, and it's and parts of it can change form a little bit, but I don't have it in front of me, so I don't want to get it wrong. But I mean, it's a bit bigger uh, than a space shuttle, and it kind of has a similar idea as a space shuttle, but a lot more room for people in it. And of course, while it's not armed itself, it has a lot of room for weaponry, which is normally deployed on the ground. But the problem is, after an exciting battle scene, when the suborbital vessel has landed in Eastern Europe to rescue some important scientists from in the book, on the cover of the book, for some reason the copywriter said terrorists, but they're not terrorists. They're actually an organized crime group that working for Russian intelligence. Russian intelligence interacts with different organized crime groups. It will use the Russian mafia when it wants to, but then so did the CIA use the American mafia sometimes. So it is a kind of Russian mafia that has captured these guys at the direction of the Russian intelligence services. And our heroes go and rescue them, and there's a pitched battle and very interesting use of near future weaponry, especially development of drones to another level besides what we're seeing in places like the Ukraine war now. The next level of that, an experimental soldier, semi-robotic armor the soldier wears, things like that. And then there is good old-fashioned tactics on the part of the Army Rangers. And Army Rangers are also airborne people. The Army Rangers are part of the Army Airborne Service. And so they became, in this future, the actual Space Force in Trump's irritating expression,
Yeah.
which, you know, is soldiers who move through space in order to enact militarily on the Earth. And so they rescue these people, and there are complications when that happens, which I won't give away. And then they get in their vessel, takes off, goes to orbit, and then they're attacked by the Russians for reasons that will be explored in the book, that are explored there. And the craft is crippled and forced to move into higher orbit. It's losing air by degrees. It hasn't got much communication, and they're in danger of another attack from the Russians. And this attack, they realize, has come from a Russian satellite that was supposed to be just purely remote controlled, but is actually a battle station with people in it. And so this is a secret program the Russians have, and this is all prediction. I think there will be battle stations in orbit. There are indications that designs for them on the part of the Chinese and the Russians and the United States are all being worked up. I have some information that actually comes from insiders that I can't talk about. I can say that in what is called an architecture of military communication techniques and command and control for orbital military forces is now being mounted in a test form in orbit over the United States. And they call it an architecture. It's so that they can picture it in a three-dimensional form, like, you know, as one does with architectural plans. But it has to do with satellites and transmissions, and beyond that I can't say. But some of that is described and extrapolated on in Suborbital 7.
Well, and one of the
It's
things
just fiction, folks. It's just fiction.
Sure.
I just made it up. Those things aren't happening now. Well, let's pretend that they aren't.
Well, that's the thing, is this is one of the things, and I don't, really think you're one of the first names that comes to mind with hard science fiction, because you're mostly thought of as being, from the cyberpunk camp. But this is a hard science fiction novel, and it's very well researched, and it feels, very realistic. And one of the things that works about it is that when you're kind of in the action and in the moments, of tension for some of the characters, like it really feels like you're going to be, like it feels like something that could be happening or is happening.
Yes,
And that's
it's the expression is 15 minutes into the future. Well, it's longer than that, but it's not very far into the future, and it's all very extrapolated from current development, and idea and real ideas. And I've added some new things of my own, but
yeah.
the use of space debris in certain ways, which we will not give away in this interview, is based on the existence of certain devices that are being planned.
We can come back to that after we give our spoiler warning. But
I don't want to give away any spoilers. I don't want to do any spoilers beyond what I already have. I don't think, really, but.
Well, what I like to do on here is give a point where somebody can pause it and can come back after they've read the book, and where we can really talk about the writing process.
Well, let's see what we get then. Go ahead and ask your questions.
Well, I'll give a spoiler warning in a bit, but let's keep trying to make sure that we make sure that people will get to that reading point. We're gonna sell people on this book, and this is one of the best reads I had of the year. It was super fast. Now I read a huge chunk of this book just on a bus ride to and from something here in town, and I almost missed my stop on the bus because I was so engrossed in a scene involving the Japanese space station. And one of the things that I really liked about this book was, like I said, that solving problems in space. Like the best stories that take a hard science fiction look at space travel are the ones that generally are people trying to, solve the problem of space is always trying to kill you. Right. And so like it has this, like, there's the war story, and then there's the soldiers, but there's also this kind of Apollo 13 thing where they're trying to like stay alive and solve the problems in space. So there's multiple different narrative drives towards where the tension comes from and keeps the book feeling propulsive and moving forward. So that's one of the things I want to say about, on my end of like selling, like why this is one of my favorite reads of the year. But as far as the research goes, like I think some people would be really interested in like, your process in researching this, because like it feels very real. So there's a lot you had to learn. How much of that did you start writing and fill some of that stuff in, or did you make sure you had that stuff available to you before you started?
Pretty much the latter. I mean, I did write an outline.
Yeah.
And I don't always outline for my books, but I had to in this case. And I did write an outline in advance. But apart from that, I didn't write, really launch into the actual writing of the novel until I'd had a great deal of research under my belt. I read a number of books, I mean, actual physical books. And I also read some techno thrillers, contemporary techno thrillers, because I wanted to see, what were the conventions of the genre currently. I mean, I was familiar with Tom Clancy, and there was nothing like what I was doing. So I found that reassuring, and also I felt like, yes, this actually kind of is my state of mind naturally anyway, this kind of thing. I mean, I feel like the Eclipse books have a techno thriller element to them, for example.
Absolutely.
Trilogy. And in this novel, there are cyberpunk elements, like when there are scenes on Earth, there's a brilliant electronic intellectual or IT kind of wizard who has a fear of going outside, and so he's wrapped up in this thing in a remote kind of way, and then he comes under attack in a way that is kind of classic cyberpunk. And so there's that. Also, there's espionage elements in the book. There's a viewpoint character who's an American CIA agent who works with the suborbital group, and there are wheels within wheels happening on Earth at the same time as our story unfolds in orbit. And we cut back and forth to a certain degree, but the majority of the book happens in space, in orbit. And so I had to research that vastly, and I had to read in memoirs. I read memoirs of astronauts, and they talk about the physical stresses of being up there for long periods, and all the different peculiarities of it, like what it does to your sinuses, for example, all these things that I brought into it.
Which was very grounding and really like
yes, I was looking to put people right in it, rather than just talk about it, like just say,
no pun intended
across the room. I wanted to the word grounding is pretty ironic here.
Yes.
In orbit, but still,
exactly.
in a storytelling sense, yes, I wanted to ground it. So I read memoirs. And I read books about the near future development of orbital technology, recommended by futurist friends of mine. I have friends from the Stanford Research Institute who are experts on all manner of coming technologies, and I consulted them, and then they have friends who have friends who are friends of military people, and I was able to get information about developments there. And then there are journals that are only read by aerospace people. They're obscure journals that are not for the general public because they're not light reading. It's like they're like science journals, and so to read those you have to be a little dedicated, but you can find them online, and then you can also find, I got some physical copies sent to me on these subjects, and I pored over them. So I did all of
And it
that and
shows.
more, and of course I used the internet in a very careful way. When I research on the internet, I'm very careful about the sources, how reputable it is,
Yeah.
and the names, the background of people who I'm referring to and learning from. And also all of this came together, and it's just a big process. Yeah, it took some time to do. I don't know how long. It must have been 4 or 5 months. And plus which I'd always had an interest in it anyway.
Yeah.
I've been interested in, in the military and space for a while, and I grew up being interested in astronautics, and I read Arthur Clarke's fiction and nonfiction, and so there's that background too.
Well, and I will say too that one of the best military science fiction novels I read in the last couple of years just happened to be a Predator novel called Forever Midnight,
Oh,
and written by yours truly. And
no, yours, me truly, not
you
yours
truly,
truly.
yeah, I'm sorry, you truly, yeah, yours, you truly, yeah. Sorry, that came off wrong. Sorry, but yeah, your Predator novel is one of the best military sci-fi novels I've read in the last couple of years. It just happened to be a Predator novel, and
Mhm.
it was a really great throwback to that feeling of the like kind of 60s.
Yes, golden or silver age or something.
Yeah,
Science
yeah,
fiction. I even made references to old science fiction writers in it. But
yeah.
I wrote that some years ago, and it just shows how much I've been thinking about the military and space for a long time.
Yeah. And that one I would highly recommend, even though it's just a Predator novel. Like, but again, it's one of those times where I felt like you elevated the tie-in novel in a really serious way. I love that one. But before we get into spoilers, did you again Suborbital 7 is out in paperback, so you can get that.
Yeah, trade
And
paper.
you should. And I'm sure there's a few signed copies still floating around at Artifact Books. So in Encinitas. So if you want to get a signed copy from there, or that's one I recommend because Greg's a great bookseller and we want to support him. So yeah, buy Suborbital 7. But also, can you tell folks a little bit about on Gunmetal Mountain, which is your other most recent book that just came out?
There's a kind of weird relationship between science fiction and westerns. I mean, a lot of people have observed that, there's horse opera and space opera.
Yeah.
But they've also observed that many science fiction stories are about a guy coming from who's new in the colony, for example, or the space station, and he changes things up with his powerful presence there, and his I mean, even the Expanse has a touch of that. And there's this sense of this kind of wilderness and people struggling through the wilderness of the solar system in the Expanse TV show. And so there is cross currency between science fiction and westerns for a lot of reasons. My westerns are, I try to make them classic. I'm probably really influenced by certain classic filmmakers like John Ford and Hawks and Howard Hawks and Anthony Mann, and by books like Lonesome Dove. I try to make them super realistic, at the same time still adhering to the classic formula up to a point. But there's a lot of gray area in them. Like with Lonesome Dove, it's not exactly good guys and bad guys.
Well, I really love the first one of your Western series and your Western Wyatt and Wichita. Your first Western is very good as well.
I'd like to tell you one thing though about Gunmetal Mountain and Axel Bus Creek, and the third one is called Blood and Sweet River, coming next year. It's a trilogy. So there's the hero who is a gunfighter who was a former Union officer back in the Civil War. Still carries a torch for the Republic and for the implicit civil rights that they were fighting for. And he falls in love with a lady who turns out to be a natural philosopher, which is a scientist, as in the parlance of the Old West, or in the 19th century parlance. And so there were educated ladies out there that people think there were only these uneducated pioneer women of as in old television shows or something, but there were all kinds of people, and many of them were very educated. And there were a couple of famous women who were scientists who actually contributed information about the flora and fauna of the West. So one of my main characters is this woman who is a natural philosopher against the background of the Old West. And so science enters into it, but there's nothing fanciful about it. It's just new scientific discoveries being discussed, and even the possibility of electric lights and the telephone are mentioned. And she uses her scientific abilities to help her gunfighter sweetheart in a couple of cases. And yet it's not a steampunk sort of book, as that makes it sound, but so
Yeah.
that makes it different. She's a suffragist, for example. She's a women's rights person. So that it makes it different from your classic Western. And I've even gotten some pushback from some readers saying, what is this liberal propaganda in my Westerns here? But it has suffragists as women's rights and science. It's pro-science in a Western, but I find ways to make it all fit together and make it natural. So that's all part of this cleave true Western trilogy.
Yeah, and the first book has a real sense of justice about it that I think that really ties it to your other work. So
yeah, social justice is a theme in these novels.
Yeah, for sure. All right, folks at home, go get Suborbital7 if you haven't already. If you can just get it, and this is the point where you pause and come back. This is your spoiler warning. You can go read the book and then come back. You won't regret it. We'll get you some details. This is also good for the writers who are gonna who have just ideally you've just finished the book, you've unpaused it, you're coming back and you're listening, and we're going to talk about some of the nitty-gritties of Suborbital7. The first one I want to talk about is the character of, and I'm going to have to I believe it's Alexei, the one whose brother was killed by the friendly fire, right, and with CIA asset.
Okay, that is a big spoiler right away.
Yeah, well, we're in spoilers. And one of the things I thought was really great about you doing this in the narrative is that it puts a live grenade inside the S7 craft. So I thought that was a really important thing that you did, because that ideally there should only be people that they trust there, right? but here's this guy who's a ranger who was brought in specifically because he's going to try to extract his brother, if I'm remembering it correctly. And then this sets up the tension inside the craft. How
Yeah.
early in the process did you have this part of the story? Was that there from the outline, or was that
Yeah.
something?
Well, I knew that that it would make it a much more interesting and believable and human story if there was some issues with one of the crew members, and I didn't want them to be some kind of just crazed villain or something. I wanted to understand what he was going through. I mean, he does kind of lose it, but uh, for various reasons that seen from his point of view, he had reason to feel betrayed by the other Rangers and by the United States, which he devoted himself to until now. So, and yeah, he's a complex, not exactly a villain, but a very dark character anyway.
Mhm.
And yeah, I felt like, people are not these cookie cutter soldiers. They're some of them are going to have weaknesses of different kinds, and there are other characters who have weaknesses, who are neurotic or scared or incompetent or a little bit. One in particular. So, and then there's some nepotism has gone on, and there's a character who is on the mission who probably shouldn't be because of nepotism, his father being a general, and that is another complication in the story.
Right. And that was a really good complication, because what that sets up, narratively speaking, is that the general on the ground has a reason to make some kind of poor choices because he wants to get his son back. And why, of course he would. So that was a really great narrative addition to it. The other one of the ones that I thought was interesting is that the mission is successful pretty quickly as far as like freeing the hostages. That's something that when I was starting to read it, I expected that maybe that would you know be later in the story, but of course the it makes sense that what you're doing narratively, I think, is like showing that these guys are good at what they're doing. But and had the Russians not had this battle station in space, they would have gotten them back, pretty fast. But that's
Yeah,
the complication that comes up.
it does, and you could almost pitch this story in a one line summary is something like in the future, America kicks Russia's ass, but in space.
Right.
And because a lot of us are angry at Russia right now. I'm not angry at Russians, but I'm angry at Putin and the oligarchic layers of Russian autocracy and all those people connected to that, and the Russian um, means of making war, which is very dishonorable at this time. Um, they allow rapes and they allow assaults on unarmed people, and they're really it's caught up in a bad culture of military oversight that goes back to Chechnya, places like that. They've been doing this for a generation now, getting worse and worse about how they engage in military actions with respect to civilians.
Well, the fear of the Russians coming in on the German side was something that was really important to me in The Last Night to Kill Nazis, because that's something that I read about in the research, was how much the Germans, feared they really feared the Russians coming in. And there was entire battles fought in order to make sure that the Americans made it to capture parts of Germany first, because they knew they were in better hands being captured by the Allies than the Russians.
Yeah.
And so, like, this goes way back.
After Stalingrad, after all.
Absolutely. And the Russians had reasons to be upset too. I'm not saying that, um, but and that's palatable in this novel too, is that there's a lot of really good details about actually both sides, like who are some of the kind of the power structures pulling the strings in Russia and in the Pentagon. And so there's really fun moments with that on both sides.
Yeah, I go into the point of view of some, Russian intelligence service people, and briefly, I don't, but intermittently in the story, so we get a sense of their thinking and how this actually happened and the divisions. And this, of course, is set post Putin. He's not going to be around at this point, but there is still a kind of Putin-esque culture going on there that makes the conflict in orbit possible. And an important thing to remember about conflict in orbit is that it can become conflict on Earth very quickly. And some of the development of military equipage in orbit is designed to attack Earth's surface from orbit. That's described a little bit in this book, but in sequels, if there are sequels, it will come up more, and it's something that we have to think about. The Chinese are known to be working up orbital devices for attacking the Earth's surface from orbit of various kinds, kinetic weapons, and so on. It's a very scary prospect. So we really have a social duty to monitor military growth in space. This book isn't like pro-military growth in space. It respects, these soldiers who are trying to do their duty there. And it's not exactly against it, but it does raise cautionary notes with respect to the growth of the military in orbit. And the thing is, a lot of it can happen without our being able to really observe what's going on. We can see, you can follow some of it with telescopes and other devices, but a great deal could happen without our being aware of it. There are ways to send people to orbit without people being aware they're being sent to orbit, and put them in battle stations without people aware that these are battle stations with people in them. There are ways to do it, and these things will happen if they haven't already. Let's
Right.
hope they happen already.
One of the things that really kind of drives the story too, once we get into from a spoiler perspective here, like the fact that once S7 is up in orbit and the ship is, it's not in a state where it can land, and they're running out of oxygen, it becomes a hot potato as far as nobody feels like they can help them. And then
it is kind of analogous to what's going on with us in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And we want to help Ukraine, but we can only do it so much out of the fear of sparking a nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia. And that is not, they don't talk about it that much because they don't want to scare people, but that is what is keeping NATO from becoming fully engaged in the defense of Ukraine. Well, also, Ukraine was not a member of NATO because Russia kept threatening that if it tried to become a member of NATO, it would instantly invade. Well, then they invaded anyway.
Right.
But NATO could justify defending the Ukraine, and would, I think, but it can't too actively, because if it does, that will escalate into theoretically into a third world war. And it's the same in this novel. America can only do so much to help the suborbital crew and to stop the Russians from destroying it without the risk of sparking a nuclear war. At least that's the view of the president in my novel. And it's, and you know, it would be a really hard place to be in to make a decision about that. I mean, you're going to abandon this crew of heroes, essentially, most of them, and these scientists who are aboard, or are you going to intervene quite openly and risk all out war? It's like a horrible between a rock and a hard place situation politically.
Right. Well, and one of the things that I think really works there too is then that forces the crew to have to look for solutions on their own. And if you're just thinking, if you're in space, like you might think like, well, this is hopeless. What do we do? And then the idea that they would like find an old abandoned space station and steal their oxygen, or take their oxygen is a really excellent like kind of twist. And yeah, and that, I think it was the scene where they docked with the Japanese module, where I almost missed my bus stop. And
You almost failed to dock.
I almost failed to dock, and Anthony was already mad at me because he was waiting to go get tacos, and I was late. So I almost failed to dock, is right. But I love that aspect of it, the problem solving aspect of it. It works out, and then it kind of sets up like, a really clever scene where they use the space debris that.
I'd rather we don't say that, even though you're going to have a little break. We don't want to talk about that too much. That is like the climactic material that is really a cornerstone of.
Okay.
I would rather not give that away, even here, even though there's a break and you're saying it's only for people who've already read the book. They already know what you're talking about. And yes, I was an innovative thing for me to bring into it.
Yes. It was. And no, and the whole thing, I think, one of the reasons why I really, really responded to Suborbital7 was that I felt like, for one thing, I could see it. It just really functioned as a movie in my head. I could see it all, and it just like makes a lot of business sense for if and I saved this comment for spoilers because I think it relates to things that I do consider spoilers, which is one of the things that makes it such a marketable or make it such a great film is that you would have limited sets because a lot of the action takes place inside the spaceship, much similar to Apollo 13, right?
Mhm.
And so the only problem, which I think Alcon, out of all production companies in all of Hollywood, knows better than anybody, is how to make zero gravity look good, because they did the Expanse, right? And so the hardest part would be the zero gravity. And
Well, they do it if they can do it now with today's special effects. Well, it's just it has to be done carefully. Although actually, as I mentioned in the book, it isn't zero gravity. It's microgravity.
Microgravity, yeah.
But to all intents and purposes, it's zero gravity. You're in the gravity well of the Earth, going way out from the Earth, like more than half, even past the moon. You're still in the gravity well of the Earth. So there's still some gravity even past the moon, but it's just so micro that it may not even as well be there really for practical purposes.
Yeah, and speaking of somebody who wrote a space elevator thing, like once you start looking into space and you start like actually getting into the mile, like, this is how many miles, or this is what happens at this many miles.
Oh, it's difficult. It's
Yeah.
technical. I had to consult about things like that. I didn't have a space elevator in this, but I'm 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 thinking of writing about it more extensively for another future project. I'm very interested in them. What was that Brad Pitt movie where it starts out with things going
Ad
wrong?
Astra.
Ad Astra, an underrated movie. I mean, I
I,
suppose
I
it's not
liked it too. I
perfect.
had
I think more people should see that. I feel it was pretty realistic, and it's just like tackles things that others haven't. And I just think, if you're looking for a good science fiction kind of a reality based science fiction movie, that's a pretty good one, man. Ad Astra, and all the acting is good, but especially at the beginning they have this
that
wonderful
opening
scene with
scene
this.
is incredible. Yeah.
Yes, the wonderful scene with a space elevator, which is this giant tower, and theoretically that a lot of people are still trying to find a way to pay for the construction of these things, that goes all the way from the surface of the Earth to orbit, and low orbit. And they have this wonderful scene where something goes wrong, it really puts everything in perspective about our relationship to orbital technology, and the fact indeed that space is always trying to kill us,
Mm.
and gravity is working hard against you too, really. They didn't handle it technologically or scientifically very well in the movie Gravity, but nevertheless, there was the concept anyway of being up there and falling to, into the atmosphere, and the risk of that, and think about what that would be like to burn up in the atmosphere as you fall,
Yeah.
well, in your spacesuit. And I did talk about that in Suborbital 7 somewhat.
My problem with that Astra was that it kept getting compared to 2001, and I felt like that was a terrible comparison
Yes,
because
not like it.
no, because there's no mystery in Ad Astra. In fact, there's the one scene that I don't like in the movie, there's a scene where it basically ridiculously almost puts in flashing neon lights the point of the movie, and like the message of it, and like you can't compare yourself to 2001 if you're going to not be ambiguous about your point at all. So
Well,
that was my only problem
2001,
with it.
is
It was
yeah,
good overall.
okay. Don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I love 2001. I wouldn't change any of it. Ad Astra was good overall, and
Oh no, I
it's just
agree with
hard.
you.
It's hard to find
2001.
a good technologically believable science fiction movie that's well realized and with good actors, and that's one.
Yeah, I overall liked Ad Astra, and I thought the entire movie was worth the trip to the theater and the money I spent for
And there's
that,
some
for the
space
first scene.
military bits in it too.
Yeah.
There are people. There's combat on Mars, on the moon rather.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
that is really pretty cool. That's, the combat scenes on the moon are pretty cool.
I thought that opening scene was worth seeing the whole thing for as well
Yeah.
on the big screen. Thought that was great. So I'm not talking crap, and I certainly am not talking crap for 2001 because I love 2001. So, but just to finish up on Suborbital 7, um, yeah, I think Burkett and as a character, I thought it was good having his wife kind of advocating for him on the surface, was kind of created some. I thought what that does is it kind of humanizes the situation a little bit. It reminds characters that these guys aren't just, that they have lives, they're going back to, that kind of thing. So that was important. And what I think is really great too about like the premise is that obviously you could do more missions for that. So obviously you've thought about that.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, and we think at the end of the novel, well, I don't want to give that away either, but the main character, the main protagonist, will be coming back at some point, I'm sure.
Yeah.
This is not definitely, written contractually yet, but I believe it will happen.
All right. Well, John, it was awesome talking to you about this book. It's definitely, man, it's a quick read. It's I think that's one of the things that I can best say about it is that, I flew through this. It doesn't hurt that feeling that 2 books before this, I read a 900-page book that took me 2 weeks to read. And so this felt really quick.
What was that?
The Deluge. It's a sci-fi novel by Stephen Barclay. It's one of those books that's science fiction, but it's called literature by marketing. But it's really basically a modern Stand on Zanzibar. In many ways, it's got the kaleidoscopic view of one of the things I thought was kind of a hole with it is that it really kind of just focuses on America. It's like kind of telling an America story about the next 20 years of climate change, and that's like, well,
yeah, I mean,
the whole globe's going to deal with it.
But if it's 900 pages, he must. Well, there's a lot of America to talk about.
Yeah. Well, my review's up there. I think there was a 500-page version of that novel that might reach more people, because a lot of people will be turned off by 900 pages. And I thought it was an important message. It was a well-written book. I think extrapolating climate change, you beat him to the Stormland concept, but there's definitely parts of the book about unending storms.
Are there some Stormlanding parts?
A little bit. It's not. There's more about heat waves and deluge, and then there's a whole section about flooding on the coast, and that's kind of where the title comes from.
Well, my novel Stormland is much more compact, and it still makes its points.
Yes, and I shouted out Stormland in my review of Deluge for sure. I also think Ministry for the Future is one. But I just also read The Heat Will Kill You First, which is the nonfiction book about the heat waves, and I think every human being alive should read that one.
There's a new report in the Washington Post about that, and it's pretty damn scary.
Yeah,
damn scary.
Yeah, well, my current book in progress is very much about a hot future Earth, so that's why I picked it up to read it, and it was scarier than I expected. And but we'll unfortunately have to shake people awake on that one. On that note, so if anyone's made it this far through the spoiler section, Suborbital7, Stormland, Gunmetal Mountain, we've got a bunch of recent releases. Also the new release of really, 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 really weird stories is out there as well. You should have, I have a 3-deep shelf section of John Shirley books, and you should too, out there. I think Philip K. Dick is the only person that gives you a run for space on the shelf, John.
Well, for good reason. I wouldn't want to try and outrun him in that sense.
Well, I'm forced to read all of his work. I have to read all of it now.
Oh, he's when he's great, he's great.
Yeah. John Brunner too. I probably have close to as many John Brunners, so there's a lot of Johns over there. So, and but I want everybody else to have these. So and definitely, I said it before, I'll say it again. Stormland was one of my favorite books of the last couple of years. I think it's definitely in the lexicon of the sci-fi novel with Ministry for the Future and the one I was just talking about, The Deluge. So please read it. John, you're active on Mastodon and Blue Sky if people want to find you there.
Yes.
So, yep. And I'm trying to be better about Blue Sky. I'm trying to use Blue Sky more. So I've been catching up on book reviews today, and they will all be on Blue Sky. So if you're on there, people find us, and we'll be sure to interact with you. On that note, as always, I just want people to keep reading, sharing these works, writing reviews. Everything helps for those of us indie writers. We appreciate it. And John, we'll have you back again for the next one. Thanks for joining us.